Hello, my name is Sandra Geyer. I'm a soprano singer, a broadcast presenter and braille music teacher, and a very warm welcome to episode 1 of our journey through braille music, a series which in 6 episodes is revealing what braille music is all about. In this episode, exploring the history and background, I'm joined by James Risdon.
Hello.
And James Bowden.
Hello.
Now, to start us off, could you introduce yourselves and say a little about what we're going to discover during this episode?
Hello, I'm a recorder player and play music spanning the Middle Ages to the 21st century and learn most of my repertoire from braille. I really couldn't do without it. I worked in the music advisory service at RNIB for 9 years, where I taught braille music and produced resources and met dozens of braille music readers and teachers.
Hello, I'm a pianist and organist, and I started learning braille music late in primary school and then learnt all my pieces from grade 5 upwards in braille, and I still find that braille music is a great way to learn pieces today. In my work as a braille technical officer, it brings me into contact with all sorts of questions about braille, including braille music.
So in this episode, we'll learn about some of the history and background to braille music. Then in episode 2, we'll look at the basics and how this works for solo instruments such as flute or recorder. Then in episode 3, we'll take a look at vocal music.
In episode 4, we'll look at how braille music works for keyboard instruments such as the piano. Episode 5, we'll speak to Melanie Wren, one of the RNIB braille music transcribers, about her work. And finally, we'll try and wrap things all together in episode 6.
Sounds like great stuff. So James and James, I wonder if you could start by explaining the significance of braille music in your work as musicians. James Bowden, let's start with you.
So for me, basically, there are 2 ways to learn a piece of music, either by ear or by braille music. So if I learn something by ear, it's very quick to give me a rough idea of what the piece is going to do, but for serious music learning, braille music will give me access to all the little details and so on in the score. I use braille music when I need to learn a piece of classical piano music or organ music, and it's great as well if I can have the words and music in a choir situation.
I started learning braille music in my school choir as well and spent many rehearsals trying to reconcile the dots in front of me with what I was hearing. I then started to learn my recorder and clarinet repertoire from braille once it got too complicated to learn by ear and I needed to know exactly what the composer intended. And now I learn most of my repertoire from braille and have quite an extensive collection of music spanning centuries and all sorts of different types of music, including clarinet orchestral parts, which I've used over the years. I think for me, braille music is a tool that allows me to work independently and on the same terms as sighted colleagues.
Can I just add there, if anyone is wanting to learn braille music, I would really recommend you're very comfortable with the literary code first.
I'd recommend that too. And let's go right back to the dawn of braille time. Who invented braille music and when did this take place?
So Louis Braille invented not only the literary braille code with all the letters and numbers and punctuation, but also the braille music code. And what's amazing that he did this in conditions which we know were cold and damp and pretty miserable, really. It's also remarkable that the fundamentals of braille music have remained pretty much unchanged. There have, of course, been additions and refinements, but it's still pretty much as it was. Should say, though, it's worth mentioning that it did take many years for the system to be adopted across the world. Now nearly 200 years old, braille music dates back to the time when Mendelssohn and Chopin were teenagers.
It's worth remembering that this wasn't some academic exercise. Louis Braille was himself a musician. He wanted access to print notation to study and to learn from, and indeed to be able to write himself. Before this time, blind musicians learnt everything by ear, or sometimes from raised print notation, often were considered little more than circus acts or street entertainers. Louis Braille's work really paved the way for blind musicians to be able to earn a living as a musician, and many continue this to this day.
So let's hear a little music now. This is a short extract of Prière pour ma mère, Prayer for My Mother, by Gabriel Gauthier, whom it was said was a very good friend of Louis Braille. Could you explain how Braille music was developed from literary Braille? James Bowden.
So both literary and music Braille are based on the same 6-dot cell. If you imagine an egg box standing on its end, you've got 2 columns of 3 dots, and these make up what we call the Braille cell. So there are 64 different combinations of dots that you can have. The cell was designed to fit neatly under the finger pad so you can read it. It's actually half the size of a system developed by Charles Barbier, who was a former artillery captain. He developed a passion for the problems of secret writing and what he called night writing for military night manoeuvres. So this was the starting point from which Louis Braille transformed the system to what we now call Braille and we use today.
And there are similarities in how the two codes were formed. So literary Braille starts with the letters A to J, which are formed using just the top 2 rows. The letters K to T are formed by adding a dot to the letters A to J. Then the letters U to Z are formed by adding another dot to the letters K to O. It sounds complex, but really it's a beautifully neat system. So in broad terms, music uses the top 2 rows to show the name of a note and the value as a quaver, and combinations of the bottom row show additional note lengths, so crotchets, minims and semibreves, etc. Again, it sounds rather random to start with, but it is probably a more concise code than print notation and avoids some of the challenges of print notation, especially for beginners.
So my background is in mathematics and computer programming. I really appreciate the logic of Braille music. I think Louis Braille would really appreciate all the technology that exists today, be thrilled to know that his invention is still thriving almost 200 years after he invented it all around the world.
And speaking of worldwide use, are there different forms of Braille music in different countries around the world?
Well, importantly, no. The code is pretty much the same across all countries. So a person in Denmark could loan a piece of Braille music produced in Australia and still make use of it.
Braille music is used on all 5 continents, and there are several important libraries of Braille music scores. The UK Association for Accessible Formats has a list of over 40 organisations in 25 countries who produce or loan Braille music.
And could you give us an idea of the breadth and variety of music covered by using Braille music?
Absolutely. Braille music can basically show anything that can be written in print, from a simple flute melody right the way through, if you like, to a symphony or an opera.
Well, I'm a singer, so that sounds very interesting for me.
Well, there's nothing stopping you having an opera in Braille, but it may take up quite a deal of shelf space, and it may take you a bit of time to find your place.
And one question I've often been asked is, how do people play or sing when using Braille music? James Risdon.
If I had £1 for every time I'd been asked that, I'd be retired by now. Actually, I've even been asked if I can read with my feet, but even if I could do that, I certainly wouldn't want to borrow second-hand scores from libraries.
So as a singer, I can either read the words or the music in real time, which means I can use Braille music in a choir situation. As an organist, if I really wanted to, I could read the Braille music with my hands and play the pedals with my feet.
So most people use Braille music will learn the music from memory. And actually that's one of the challenges in the early stages for people who find it hard to read the Braille fluently enough to hear the music in their heads. But with some practice, it does actually get easier. I must say it's not as easy for me now as it was when I was a teenager.
It's worth noting that sighted musicians have to practice for a long time before they can actually sight read. And I guess in a way it's a bit similar to that.
Now, you've explained the history and background. However, I wonder if you could say from your personal experience why Braille music is important to you. James Bowden.
So if I want to learn a piece of music, particularly classical music, and I'm going to say the word properly, I think Braille music is essential. Plus, of course, there are some pieces which simply move too quickly to learn by ear. So when I want to learn a piece of organ music or piano music, I will always see if there's a Braille music score that I can get hold of.
I think for me, as I said before, Braille music is a tool that allows me to work alongside sighted colleagues on an equal footing. It gives me the means of sharing a common language of music and enables me to play pieces I couldn't learn by ear.
And as we're nearing the end of this podcast episode, if we want to learn more, could you suggest where we could find additional information?
So there are a number of books about Louis Braille, which make fascinating reading. These include Triumph Over Darkness by Leonard Bickel and Louis Braille, A Touch of Genius by C. Michael Meller. And of course there are tutor and reference books about Braille music, which we'll mention as we go along.
And could you give us a summary of points we've covered? James Risdon.
Certainly. So Louis Braille invented not only the literary Braille code, but also Braille music. It uses the 6 dots, just like literary Braille, and like the basic alphabet, Braille notes follow a pattern.
So Braille music can show all kinds of music, from simple tunes for solo instruments, right through to advanced pieces for piano, organ. You can even have complete scores.
James Bowden and James Risdon, thank you very much. And having begun our journey with the history and background, in this next episode, we're going to explore Braille music, beginning with the basics.